Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a woman gets a job for a ward when she starts to hear weird sounds coming from the nursery. So do you trust your babies with the hospital? Because there's a strange machine in the nursery.
My mother died when I was 12 years old. It was the single most traumatic experience of my life, and I'd be lying if I said I've gotten over it. But that isn't what has affected me most lately. Whenever a parent dies, most people just talk about the death itself. There's a lot of how and when, but not a lot of then what happened. It is that lasting legacy of what happens afterwards that really marks you for life. As my dad had to pick up extra hours to make ends meet, I had to help take care of my sisters. At that age, I barely made my own bed. Now I had to cook and bug my sisters about taking their showers. My younger sisters were far more depressed than I was. I didn't have time to be depressed. I had shit to do. So now, as an adult, I can kind of see that I got stuck in that rut. I'm still taking care of people. Maybe I'm afraid of what'll happen if I stop. Originally, I wanted to be a doctor, but we just couldn't afford that kind of education. I considered studying abroad, but my sisters still needed me long into their teenage years. Instead, I studied to become a nurse, which was the cheaper option. No less work, though. Just slightly cheaper. Once my sisters and I moved out, I got my own place, and I bounced around various hospitals and nursery homes around the state. I've worked at a rehab clinic, an open clinic, as an in-home nurse. All kinds of positions. I had 8 different jobs all in all, changing back and forth between them as one closed and another opened. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I saw an opportunity for a stable job. The biggest hospital in my home area had an opening for a nurse in the maternity ward. While I hadn't worked there before, I knew most of the procedures around the LDR rooms and the NICU unit. Sorry, I'll stop with the abbreviations. I got my first interview just days after the wanted ad went up. I was called in to talk with 2 of the nurses and one of the doctors. I could tell it was sort of rushed, and it all seemed like a bit of a formality. By the way they acted, I figured they could really use the help right away. Especially Dr. Gellin, who never even sat down. She was asking me questions while still pacing around the room. Surprise, surprise, I got the job. Starting Monday the following week, I got my first tour of the place. The first few weeks, I would mostly act as a helping hand while they figured out a more static position for me. In the meantime, I'd be moving from nurse to nurse, assisting them one by one. I didn't really have any responsibility of my own at first. The first few days I spent with Dr. Gellin, helping out in the LDR. I have pretty good bedside manners, and several expecting mothers were happy to have me distract them from whatever they were going through. I also had to run a few tests, sit in on ultrasounds, and help deliver some bad news. I don't want to go into details, but pregnancy isn't always this amazing and beautiful thing. After a few days, I helped out in the reception. Then, at the emergency room, and so on and so on. After about a month of working there, I had been pretty much everywhere but the nursery. You know, the fancy room with the glass windows where newborns rest up. I had seen it in passing once, but it was sort of off-limits to newbies like me. There's a lot you must be aware of when working with someone that helpless. It was when I was assisting Nurse Rena that I finally took my first steps into the nursery. It was this large square room with several units lining the walls, well lit, with cheerful colors. It was empty when we went in there, having been cleared out for a proper spring cleaning, so it was a bit eerie.
We usually have half a dozen or so in here at a time,
said Rena.
A few more around August and September.
I was a bit distracted. I kept hearing this strange noise.
You with me?
She asked.
What did I just say?
Sorry, I sighed. There's this noise.
There's gonna be plenty of noise.
She groaned.
You better get used to it.
No, it's like... It was hard to describe. It seemed to come from the center of the room. Some sort of machine noise. A broken vent? A thump. Some kind of machine, I continued.
Focus. What did I say?
It was there, somewhere in the middle of the room, but what was it? Sorry, I smiled. One more time? As we left the room, the noise stayed in the back of my mind. It felt familiar somehow. But from where? The following days, things were getting busy. About half the patients we received had either some sort of condition or were oddly particular about their care. One woman had her partner sing-scream some kind of poem, for example. They had to be escorted out of the room. Another woman refused to have her baby without her favorite plant on the bedside table. Never seen a blue sunflower before. Never saw the kid either, for that matter. I was still assisting Rena in the nursery, and I got the opportunity to spend some time alone in that room. Even days later, the sound persisted. It was low, more like a hum, but it was definitely there. I thought it might be a heating issue, but I couldn't locate where it was coming from. I suspected the ceiling, but it had this strange echo to it that made it just as prominent near the floor. Strange. At one point, we had 5 kids in the nursery at the same time. Rena had the main responsibility, but she took me along every now and then just to quiz me and see how well I fared on my own. But now that there were little patients in there, she had no tolerance for mistakes or hesitation. One Friday night, as I was working the evening shift, I went into the nursery to roll out one of the children. Rena was already halfway down the hall, calling out to Dr. Gellin. So I had this short moment completely alone with all 5 kids. The lights were a bit dimmer, and at first I didn't notice anything. But after a few seconds, I could hear that sound again. But there was something else. As I looked around the room, I could see all the kids breathing in sync with the sound. Little chests heaving up and down. I gently pushed one of the units, accidentally waking up my little patient. As she stirred, she let out a soft cry, and for a moment, my mind blanked. I was just standing there in the middle of the room, and it felt like I was about to do something. And the machine noise was louder than ever. The kids were stirring. Maybe they could hear it too? It started to bother me. I asked a whole bunch of staff about it, but no one seemed to have any idea of what I was even talking about. If anything, the nursery was the quietest room in the entire ward. It had to be. You don't want to wake the patients. So when I started rambling about machine noises, they all just sort of tuned out. Even Dr. Gellin. Even after my time with Nurse Rena was up, I started coming back to the nursery every now and then. Sometimes, on my lunch break, I'd just stand there and listen, trying to find the source of the sound. That's actually how I got started here on Reddit. I started asking other medical professionals what that noise could be, and no one had a clear idea. I tried recording it, but it just wouldn't stick. Also, it is generally frowned upon to stand with a cell phone in the nursery, recording what could be a video. Big no-no. I went back over and over again, and it actually landed me in a bit of trouble. I had a private meeting with Dr. Gellin, who tried their best to understand my strange fascination with the nursery. Finally, I had to agree to leave my phone in my locker. I didn't go back there for a long time, but it was inevitable. The nursery is somewhat central to the entire ward, and you have to actively avoid it to never pass it. One night, as I was passing the glass window, I stopped to listen. But that time, I had a good reason. There were 4 kids in there, and they were the first thing I heard. Not the strange machine noise. The kids were crying, but they were crying in unison. Short bursts of screams. It was rhythmic in a way. I stopped to listen, and my mind immediately returned to the noise. I was sure that if I stepped inside, I'd hear the noise again. The kids. They were screaming in unison with the sound. I could feel it. And that was just the start. I could start feeling it even at home. I'd get frustrated whenever I heard my washing machine, as it was out of sync with the sound that haunted the back of my mind. Every rhythmic noise I heard just seemed off by comparison. It bothered me just how stuck that sound was, and I still had no idea what it was. And where had I heard it before? It came to a point where I sat up all night listening to a 4-hour recording of a construction site. Nothing. Nothing sounded like that goddamn machine. Ka-ka-ka-chung. At the end of a particularly long shift, as I was changing into my ordinary clothes, I stopped to listen to the hum of a fluorescent light in the bathroom. I could almost hear the rhythm of the electricity, and right there, behind my eyelids, was that rhythmic thumping again. I held my breath, and it felt like the sound was growing louder. I could feel my pulse go up. Why was I getting angry? Or was it fear? But it was real. The sound was real. The longer I closed my eyes, the clearer it was. With my eyes closed, I turned my head. The sound changed pitch. There, a direction where it was louder than ever. Loud enough to change the beat of my heart. It was coming from the nursery. God damn it. I slammed my locker shut and hurried out. I had to get to the bottom of this. The sound was so prominent that I could just close my eyes and it'd be there. It was beating in rhythm with my heart. I didn't care about anyone seeing me. I had to find out what it was. As I burst into the nursery, the newborns woke up. There were 7 of them in total. One by one, they started screaming. A steady, rhythmic scream. How had no one noticed this? How was I the only one? Ka-ka-ka-chung. Scream. Ka-ka-ka-chung. Scream. It wasn't a pained scream, more like a chant. This primal, instinctual grunt scream, almost melancholic. The sound grew louder, and my chest was pounding harder and harder. I thought I was having a heart attack. My fingers were aching, like someone was slowly turning my nerves counterclockwise. I didn't even realize it at first, but I was screaming too, to the rhythm of the grinding machine. I closed my eyes as hard as I could, trying to force the sound out of my head. Instead, it became clearer. And there, in the dark of my closed eyelids, I could finally see. It was a strange feeling, looking around the room with closed eyes. There were lines of beetles on the floor, reaching from the unit of every newborn to a spot in the middle of the room. It was clear as day, despite the darkness of my closed eyes. Black and gray beetles, marching to the rhythm of the machine, carrying little globs of white. And in the middle of the room was the source of the noise. From the side, it didn't look like much. It was sort of a pipe, with a faint yellow shine. It was about 3 feet wide, positioned in the center of the room. Line after line of beetles dove into it, the little globs of white falling out of their mouths. Despite my body screaming for me to get away, to get out, to take a breath, I had to look. With my eyes closed, I crawled forward. I looked down the pipe. It is strange not being able to close your eyes to make something go away. When you watch a scary movie, you can turn away. You can hide behind a pillow. But looking down that pipe, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't turn away, and my eyes were already closed. It is hard to describe. It was deep. Impossibly deep. Somewhere, miles below, there was a fire so bright that it burned my closed eyes. I could barely see it, shrouded behind hundreds of cogwheels, chains, live wires, and steam pipes. I just stared, watching the little beetles tumble over the edge, bumping against the absurd machinery. I could hear the little clicks and clacks of their shells as they struck the moving parts. Ka-ka-ka-chung. Something was moving. Something organic. Something living. There were hands reaching towards me. Hands getting burned on steaming pipes, getting mangled by cogwheels. But still, it kept coming upwards. I hadn't even realized that I'd stopped breathing. I'd held my breath for so long that I was getting lightheaded. I was being pulled away from the center of the room, away from the machine. Something pushed against my back, forcing air back into my lungs. There was a distant voice. 2 people were carrying me. My eyes opened, and I could see the nursery with my open eyes again. All 7 kids were lying on the floor, outside of their units. They were screaming at the top of their lungs, just like me. They heard it. I heard it. But somehow, I think they knew more about it than I did. I was carried away. They tried to get me to breathe again, but it was like my body forgot how to do it. It wasn't until I got a mask over my face, forcing air into my mouth, that I snapped back to reality. My heart was hammering away so fast and hard that my head hurt. I had no feeling in my hands, and both my feet had fallen asleep. My face was burning hot. Dr. Gellin was shining a light in my eyes, but it felt so far away. For a split second, I blinked. And there, in the darkness, I sensed something. It was a different shade of dark. It had followed me here. It was so impossibly tall, able to cross the room in just a few steps. As it reached for me, beetles tumbled onto my chest. Little globs of white getting ripped from my chest. Then, nothing. I must have passed out. They say it was some kind of psychotic episode. Hyperventilation, seizures. It didn't look good. I could no longer be around the children, so they were gonna have to either fire me or find somewhere else for me to go. It took me 2 days to recover, and I was so scared to close my eyes that they had to give me eye drops. My hands cramped from grasping the side of the bed, terrified of being picked up or pulled away in the middle of the night. At times, I could almost feel the little beetles crawling over me, picking globs of shining white out of me. Sometimes I felt the presence of something in the room. Even with closed eyes, I was scared to look. Some things can't be unseen. I was going to have a short interview with Dr. Gellin about the incident, but he was swamped that day. Instead, I got to talk to the chief physician, an older man who was a full head shorter than me. He asked me several questions about my medical history and my experience. It didn't really lead anywhere. That is, until we started rounding off the interview. As I read my social security number to him, to make sure he had my insurance info, he stopped.
Were you born in the area?
He asked. I guess, I said. You can tell?
The area number.
He nodded.
It is quite unique. There are 3 hospitals that cover that area, but 2 didn't have fully staffed maternity wards at the time you were born.
Handing my papers back to me, he gave me a long look.
You were born here, in this hospital, weren't you?
He asked. I had no idea, but it made sense. Mom had lived in this town all her life. I just nodded. He didn't respond. Instead, he just looked at me and sighed. Without a word, the meeting ended. The following week, I lost my job. While one could think it was because of my psychotic meltdown, I'm pretty sure it was because of that meeting with the chief physician. I think he knows something. If I had been born there, maybe I'd been in that room long, long ago, before I could even form memories. But if so, how could that noise sound so familiar? This was a few months ago, but I'm still looking for answers. That, and I think I'm going insane. I can still hear the click-clacking of little beetles falling to their deaths, and if I concentrate hard enough, I can hear the machine. It is not a memory. It is always there. I think there's a piece of me down there, inside it, still connected. Something listening, from the inside. Something that hurts. Little globs of white. I don't know what to make of this. I just want it out of my head. Some days I can distract myself enough not to hear it, but other days I can barely hear myself talk. It is always there, no matter what. It is like a rhythmic, haunting tinnitus. But I know there's more to it. Sometimes as I close my eyes, I can still see a faint glow in the distance. Sometimes not even in the direction of the hospital. Sometimes it is closer. Sometimes it has eyes. But the sound is the same. Always the same.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man working for a law firm decides to go above and beyond for a promotion when he starts to go insane. So, are you aware that no one has ever lived in this house?
Back in 2017, I was about 6 months out of an internship with a local law firm. I was a junior legal assistant as part of a retainer team for a statewide biodiesel business. It wasn't my only assignment, but it was the one I was formally hired for. However, during downtime, I was bounced around various teams all throughout the year. It was early February when the call came. The biodiesel place had a new owner, and he wanted to shake things up. Our jobs were safe, but he wanted to make some investments. New manufacturing plants, 2 in Missouri and 1 to the west, within reasonable driving range from their warehouses. Only problem was there were no suitable properties to build on. This could be a multi-million-dollar kind of thing, but we didn't have a property to sign off on. That is, until I realized the area they were looking at. My old hometown of Tomskog, Minnesota. I suggested looking into an old property I'd gone by 1,000 times on my way to school. It was this massive empty field on the outskirts of the town with nothing but a few rundown houses that could be easily torn down. We knew the place was privately owned, but had no idea of who the proprietor was. My boss was ecstatic. See, the client had been considering calling the whole thing off, but if we could offer them a property, we could probably get a fat bonus check, along with a finder's fee. It would be enough to take the junior part off my job title. Since I suggested it, I was given time off to get in touch with the owner of the property. There were some initial problems. The original property documents had been damaged in a flood back in 2014, and only part of the archive had been digitized. The document I was looking for might not have been digitized yet, and since no immediate documents were available, I was starting to suspect the worst. The clerk at the municipal office promised they'd get back to me with the name within 4 to 8 weeks, 12 at the most. That wasn't an option. So I packed my bags, handed my cat to my mom, got the fancy maroon BMW company car, and set my sights on familiar roads. It took me 2 stops for gas and a needlessly complicated detour because of a fallen oak tree. But I made my way to that field just as the sun started to set. After all these years, it was exactly as I remembered. One large empty property now covered in mud-stained February snow, a rundown barn at the edge of the property, and a small 1-story log cabin right next door. All roads were overgrown, and there were no discernible paths out there. I considered going back in the morning, but I figured I had some time left. Maybe there was this big plaque with the name of the owner out front. If so, I could have it all settled in a day and be on my way home before I even had the time to unpack. It was getting late, and the shadows were growing longer, but I was willing to roll those dice. I double-checked my phone, got a flashlight from the trunk, and locked my car. The snow was deep enough to reach my knees. My fancy shoes felt like paper. The cold went straight through. Still, I pushed on, beelining straight across the field. I severely overestimated how much time I had left. By the time I got to the cabin, it was already getting dark. Using the flashlight, I took a quick lap around the place, just to make sure I wasn't walking into some kind of hillbilly trap room. It didn't take long for me to realize that this place had been abandoned for years. Not only was it boarded up, but the boards used were rotten. That the place was standing at all was nothing short of a miracle. I tried knocking a little just to make sure no one was home, but I wasn't holding my breath. The place was desolate. I looked for some kind of name or plaque or hell, something carved into a wall somewhere, anything. But there really was nothing. I considered coming back in the morning, but I could see dark clouds on the horizon, and I didn't want to walk through that snow more times than necessary. I decided I'd do a little urban exploring. After all, if the door was open, it wouldn't hurt to have a peek inside. Walking up to the door, I noticed something strange. There was a carving at the top of the doorframe. Word by word, my flashlight revealed the full sentence. No one has ever lived in this house. I tried to wrap my brain around it. It didn't make much sense. What the hell did that even mean? Of course, someone had lived there. Someone built it, and someone owned the property. Why would there be a house in the middle of nowhere that no one had ever lived in? I hesitated. Something told me to just walk away and come back in the morning. The clouds on the horizon and my freezing feet were telling me otherwise. There was a carving. That meant someone had the habit of leaving messages. Chances were there might be more of them inside. Twiddling the handle a little, I noticed the door was unlocked. So in I went. The cabin had a very basic layout. There was one large room with a wooden bench facing a simple fireplace. There were 2 handmade tables, and the westernmost wall was lined with dried herbs, mostly blue and black. There was a surprisingly clean cow skin on the floor, as well as a small door on the easternmost side of the room, leading to a kitchen. It was mostly just an antique kind of stove, a couple of cabinets. But whoever had lived there must have been accustomed to a sparse lifestyle. But no, that wasn't it. I had to correct myself. The carving said no one had ever lived there. Then, why the furniture? I decided to ignore the message for the time being, instead focusing on finding the name of whoever owned the place. There might be some initials on the handmade furniture. I gently moved the bench and tables first, going over them with my flashlight. There were no obvious markings, but another problem quickly arose. My flashlight was giving up on me. It started to flicker. Looking around, I could see no other possible source of light but the old fireplace. And I couldn't imagine that thing not being clogged. Then again, there was firewood, and I did have a lighter. I quit smoking about 2 years prior, but I always kept it around, just in case. Breaking off a piece of bark and lighting it, I double-checked to make sure the smoke cleared and went up. Surprisingly, it did. Glancing at my phone, I figured I could use it for a flashlight as well, but I didn't want to drain the battery. Instead, I lit a fire and left the front door open, just in case the smoke didn't entirely clear out. Carbon monoxide poisoning ain't no joke. As the fire sputtered to life, I sat down to take a breather on the bench. It was a pretty cozy little cabin, the kind of place you'd stay in a night or two when going fishing. I could imagine my dad warming his hands by that fire. I lost him in 2010. That was the kind of place he'd always been most at home in. As I warmed my hands, watching my shadows grow longer, I could imagine him sitting next to me. I could almost hear him, and in that moment, my eyes drifted to a space right in front of the fireplace. A space where a small iron plate protected the floor. I don't know what drove me to look closer, but I realized there were no screws or nails keeping the plate down. So, with a quick touch of the fire poker, it came loose, revealing a sort of makeshift metal box. There were 4 items in total inside. A broken pocket watch, an empty hip flask, 3 spent shotgun shells, and a small journal. I went straight for the journal, checking for a name. It was getting darker outside, so I huddled around the fire. As snow began to tap against the wooden barricades, I had 2 choices: to steal this journal, or to read it by the fire as the storm raged on. It was my cold feet that decided for me. I took off my shoes and warmed them by the fire as I started to slowly read my way through the rough cursive text of the old journal. Not the kind of job I'd imagined I'd do at a law firm, but things never quite go the way you've planned. I opened the first page, hoping to find a name. Instead, I was greeted by a strange text. Journal written by. Then nothing. That was it. No name, just that. I turned the book over, back and forth. No name anywhere. I kept reading. The first page reads as follows. I once had name and creed, a couple of truths, thrown to the grave long before my end. Now I remain battered and empty. My history is unusual as my mind turns sun-bleached and distant. My heart burns of wrath, but I cannot recall as to why. I turned the page. I couldn't help but to be intrigued, if not for any other reason than to find the name of the author. This house is not my property, and to my recollection, no one has ever lived here. He proceeded to discuss at length the part of his history that he did remember. Growing up in Wisconsin, being the son of a shoemaker, little anecdotes of a long life. His first kiss, his first love, his first house. But the further along he tried to remember, the foggier it got. I was starting to think I might never find a name, but I wasn't sure why. At some point, the author recalled something happening. He couldn't explain what or why or where, but he could recall something upsetting his routine. Something came to him and it made him upset. He spoke about putting up barricades, keeping a loaded shotgun at the ready, and locking himself inside for days on end. It might have been here that I made my stand, he wrote. It could be. It should be. But I can't say that it was. He would go on to detail some sort of struggle, but he couldn't picture what it was against. The text was so strangely written. I could tell there were segments, as if written piece by piece, but it was impossible to tell just how much time had passed between them. Even in the journal, the author lamented on large segments of time randomly missing. I couldn't help but to consider the other items in the box, in particular the spent shotgun shells. The author proceeded to explain how he'd broken the pocket watch, as it had frustrated him. He was losing track of time. He might think 10 minutes had passed, only to realize the entire afternoon was gone. He broke his watch as a reminder that he couldn't trust himself anymore. Maybe I'll remember that, he wrote. Or will the watch unbreak itself? I was disrupted from my read by a sudden noise. Looking up, I could see the fire was dying out, but the sound actually came from my phone. Turns out, it was my automated time to go to bed alert. I'd been sitting there for 6 hours. That didn't make sense. I stood up, clutching the journal. There was nothing there. The cabin was empty, but I couldn't escape the sudden sense of dread. Like something awful had just happened, but I couldn't say exactly what. Looking down on the journal, I suddenly realized that I felt exactly as described by the author. I felt this unexplainable anxiousness, like that uneasy feeling you get when you feel that someone is watching you, only more palpable. Standing up with my back to the fireplace, I continued reading. He continued to explain how his flask was empty, but that he couldn't remember drinking from it. He detailed his plans to conceal a few items, along with his journal, for an entire day, just to see if he could remember to retrieve it. But not yet, he lamented. There are trespasses to deal with. This was where the spent shells came into play. The author revealed how he'd found a group of strange trespassers. He'd taken them all out with his shotgun. He wrote in detail about shooting 3 times, but that he couldn't remember anything about them. Men, women, or children. There was no way to tell. I buried them by the barn, he detailed. It seemed like the right thing to do. Why am I crying? As the journal neared its end, the author tried to summarize his remaining thoughts. Something came to him. Wherever he was, it did something, and as a result, everything was destroyed. He was devastated, but couldn't even remember why. It was like muscle memory. Something in his body was remembering the sadness. I inscribe upon this door, he wrote, that no one has ever lived here. I do not recall this place, or anyone living here. It serves as a warning and a reminder that this is not my home. And with the final page, the author documented putting it all in a sort of hidden lockbox in front of the fire. He would do so for 1 day to see if he could remember retrieving it. Evidently, he couldn't. With the final words on the final page, he gave one last piece of insight, perhaps in a moment of clarity. It started when I lit the fire, he wrote. Everything turned worse after I lit the fire. Looking back at the fireplace and the sputtering logs, I slowly came to the realization of what kind of situation I'd put myself in. I had accidentally followed the footsteps of a man who used to be in that cabin. A man that might have owned it, but couldn't even remember it. Or who knows, maybe he was just passing by. I decided to take my chances and just leave. I brought the journal along, opened the door, and prepared to brave the weather. But something happened, right then and there. Something made me stop, and I just stood there. I stood there long enough for my hands to turn blue, and I only snapped out of it when a snowflake hit my eye. I wasn't alone, there was something there, and it was doing something to me. I had rung the damn dinner bell. Thinking about it, it feels a bit like being eaten alive. Not physically, but the same feeling remains. This heedless consumption, something taking an intimate part of what makes you into you and tearing it away. That's what I still remember. That's what it feels like, but it is hard to explain something I can't remember. It feels like a void in your mind, but you have this instinct to fill it with something bad. Like watching a scary movie and knowing something horrifying is about to pop up. Every time I think about it, trying to picture it in my mind, I get that same feeling. Sometimes my mind fills it as a sort of organic darkness, roughly shaped as a person. Other times it's just some guy. It changes whenever I look back at it because there's nothing there for me to remember, so my mind fills in the blanks. But who's to say that all those blanks are false? I turned around and realized I'd been exposed to this thing. It was doing something to me, and it was bad enough to make me run headfirst into the dark. Looking back at this, all I really remember feeling was that immense panic. A prey reflex, like trying to escape a wild animal. I ended up in the old barn, where I hid behind a mound of debris next to one of the collapsed walls. My fingers were freezing, but I was going to call for help no matter what. Only problem was, I couldn't remember the code to unlock the phone. I tried, but between my fingers being too cold to register, something unfathomable approaching from just around the corner, I decided it was better to hunker down and be quiet. Because while I can't remember anything about the physical features of it, I remember thinking it wasn't very perceptive for some reason. It passed me by, but I couldn't make any sounds without revealing my position. Calling for help was out of the question. Instead, I turned my attention back to the journal. My lock screen had a bright picture blurred in the background, allowing me to use it as a makeshift mini flashlight of sorts. For some reason, I wasn't afraid that the creature would spot me visually. Perhaps it didn't have eyes? I turned the pages back and forth, looking for a particular segment. There was something about the weapon the author had used to deal with the intruders that left me wondering, but I could barely make out anything in that journal. Between my pounding heart, my freezing hands, and the strange thing lurking about, I couldn't make heads or tails of the damned cursive text. I can't remember what kind of sounds the creature made, but I can remember the sounds the environment made when it passed. I remember wood splintering as something climbed the walls. I remember creaking wood from a sudden weight coming down. I remember a door splintering as it was torn from its hinges. Finally, I found the page I was looking for. Just after talking about how he didn't know why he was sad about killing the intruders, the author wrote, "I threw the damn thing into the hayloft. I have not been able to retrieve it, as the memory of its shape eludes me." How does one recognize a weapon that one has no recollection of ever wielding? I waited for the entity to step outside before I made my way upstairs. It is a strange feeling, trying to balance the instinct to run with the obsessive thought of staying quiet. Every creaking floorboard sent shivers down my spine, curling my toes in anticipation of something running me down. But nothing happened. It didn't take long for me to find it. An old double-barreled hunting rifle. Looking over it, I saw that there was some sort of shell still loaded. Perhaps it had worked, perhaps not. I was no expert, and I didn't have much of a choice but to try. I'd be a sitting duck out there without it. After all, I couldn't remember where I'd parked my car. I decided to go on the offensive. I made my way down the stairs a little too quick, and before long I heard this scurrying noise as something entered the old barn. I remember standing a good 15 feet away from it and raising the weapon towards it. It stopped, but so did I. For a while, we just sort of circled one another. I remember my movement being in response to a threat. Is this eat or play? I asked. If this is you eating, I bet all those memories disappear after a while. Digest it. Then you wouldn't remember what this is, or what it does. But you do, don't you? I remember tapping the rifle for emphasis. There was a long pause, but I can't remember why. Did it respond? Could it talk? If you're just playing, then you might remember that this thing is loaded, I continued. And you might know what it does. You saw what happened when he used it. You heard it. A shorter pause. We stopped circling. I gripped the weapon tighter and stepped forward, advancing. If this was a consumer, and it worked in any way like we do, it would absorb and convert what it fed on into some sort of nutrient. But if it was just collecting for some reason, then it would have this archive of thoughts to recollect from. That was my reasoning. Or maybe it was just clever. Maybe it was just as clever as I was. I made my way back outside. Even in the newly fallen snow, I managed to find what remained of the path I'd made when I first got there. I walked backwards down the path, my rifle steadily aimed at something. I didn't want to pull the trigger. If it misfired or I missed, I was dead. Just having the means of defending myself was enough to keep it away, for now. I think it had left some sort of toxin in me. Despite not being anywhere near me, I still felt the effects of it. I kept falling into this sort of fugue state, getting turned around and losing grip of where I was going and why. At one point, I was just standing there, gawking at the dark, as my rifle thumped to the ground. But there, in the dark, a memory surfaced. The same memory I'd felt back at that cabin. Thoughts of my dad taking me fishing. Back then, we'd worn rubber boots, and instead of snow, there was mud. It was still deep, and I had to walk the same way that I did in the snow. Maybe that's what triggered the memory to begin with. I tried to keep that image in my head. The anticipation as we gathered our bait. Learning how to tie a proper knot. getting the correct measurements for the distance between the hook, the weight, and the bobber. I could almost hear the spinning fishing line as the red and white bobber sailed across the lake. Just holding on to something I knew I couldn't forget was all I needed. It became this sort of bedrock, keeping me from completely losing my mind and focus. I could keep going, holding on to something I knew to be true. It was a backstop, keeping me from losing track. I grabbed the rifle and pressed on. As I did, I remember something rustling the nearby trees, retreating into the woods. By the time I made it back to my car, the toxin had completely taken hold of me. At that point, I had little to nothing to hold on to, but for a few cherished memories. I crawled into my car, locked all the doors, and tucked myself into a fetal position in the back seat, still clutching the rifle. My body didn't know how to react. I was hot, cold, wide awake, and deeply unconscious, all seemingly at random. I would lose my sense of object permanence, bobbing my head back and forth, completely forgetting what I was doing and what was even happening. At one point, something made the passenger door creak. Maybe someone tried to open it. Luckily, all doors were locked and I had the keys. I remember laying in the back of the car, raising the rifle. Then there was a pause, a long one. Something made me shake my head. It made me angry and afraid, very afraid. It left me with this sense of a rabbit being stared down by a pack of wolves. I had something it wanted, something it deeply valued. Again, this creature is just this nothingness. I can't recall what it looked like or if it was even a physical being. From context, I think it could talk. I think it said something to me that I didn't want to hear. To this day, when I think of it, my mind just conjures these otherworldly horrors. Teeth, skin, claws. But I didn't lower my rifle. Not for a second. I didn't try my luck, and I didn't challenge fate. And by the time the sun rose, it was gone. And with it went the sweats, the confusion, and much of the memory voids. First thing I did was check the shotgun shell. Turns out, it was already spent, empty. That leaves a lot of questions, uncomfortable ones. If that thing was just collecting, it would have known that I couldn't hurt it. If it knew that, why did it let me go? Did I trade it something? How would I even know? But if it was just feeding, then how did it know to stay away from the rifle? I have managed to put the story together piece by piece. Some of my memories are still a bit touch and go, but this is the most complete retelling I can make. I've tried to fill in as many blanks as I can, but it's hard. I kept the journal. I think I still have it somewhere. I showed it to my boss, but it was a weak comfort. The client eventually ended up choosing another site, leaving us in an awful position. Needless to say, that trip didn't get me promoted. That happened years later. Yeah, I still work there. Same firm. I get the feeling that this thing didn't just make people forget things. It made people be forgotten too. Despite all my efforts, not a single person I've met or talked to can remember anyone ever hearing anything about the people who used to live here. Even the cleric at the municipal office kept forgetting I'd even made the request to inquire about the land to begin with. That might have just been laziness, though. But I get this feeling that I'm missing something. Even though I've wrapped my head around most of this, and most of what happened out there, I often get the feeling that I lost something. In those moments, when everything in the world feels uncertain and half true, I look back at that day with my dad. I listen to the spinning of the fishing line. But here's the thing, Reddit. This is what bothers me. This is what made me want to post, to kind of save this for posterity. Like a journal of my own, hidden by my own fireplace. Lately, I can't remember what my dad's eyes looked like. Am I just forgetting, or is something forgetting it for me?